The Institute of Internal Auditors presents All Things Internal Audit Tech. Carey Blakeman sits down with Marko Horvat to discuss how audit committees should rethink internal audit's role amid disruption, data proliferation, and rapid technology shifts. From hidden risks and shadow AI to authority versus accountability, they unpack how boards can navigate change, embrace scenario planning, and prepare for the next disruption with confidence.
Marko, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Carey. I'm excited to be here. And it's really interesting to have these conversations to make sure that as we're building the top levels of our structures, that they're adaptive, right? And that they're also reflective of the changing environment.
So our big question that I'd love to start off with is how should audit committees rethink internal audit's role as disruption and new technologies reshape governance?
I think it's important to first think about how are these environments evolving. So what are the challenges that these internal auditors or these internal audit committees are facing? And one of them is obviously the pace of technology. So we know that the big elephant in the room is generative AI and just AI in general. And to give you an idea as to how that pace of technology has affected us, Netflix took, I believe it's 5 years to reach 1 million subscribers. ChatGPT-3 comes out in November of 2022, and they reach 1 million subscribers or 1 million users in 3 months. So the pace and adoption of technology is something we've never seen before. But it's not just the pace of technology, right? We see this longer trend in terms of information flowing. Everybody wants to be a data-first organization. Data is going to help us win the day. And just the volume and pace of information that's flowing through organizations now is something we've never seen before. So being able to sift through it, understand not just the signal from the noise, but new risks and new opportunities that are emerging is something that's incredibly difficult, just given not only the volume, but the pace of the flow. And then finally, just the way we work has fundamentally changed. So distributed workforces, tech-enabled work models, even this, recent return to the office thing, which seemed to have caught fire earlier in the year, but seems to have fizzled out. Even when we return to the office, we're returning to a fundamentally different office than the one we left. So the entire environment is changing around them. And I think it is really important that we don't just go through the same paces as we think about things from an audit perspective.
Even though we all know and are living them, they're good reminders that there are very big things that happened in the last 4 to 5 years that do make the risk look different. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on those risks, kind of thinking of it from a data exposure in this digital first world. What are risks that you see are emerging that especially internal audit should highlight to the boards or to the audit committees? But then also thinking from an audit committee perspective, what should they be thinking of that then they could talk maybe to their internal auditors about?
There's the external risks, which I think we've all kind of heard about, right? And then there's also internal risks, just the fundamental functioning of the organization. The external risks are things like taking care of your proprietary data, making sure that your IP is protected, trade secrets don't get leaked out, et cetera. That is incredibly important. So understanding what tools people are using, how they're using it, what our risk tolerance is, what the proper guidelines we have to make sure that those sort of mission critical proprietary data points don't get released out into the wild. And then, thinking about what are the scenarios that we sort of deploy in the event that something like that happens, which we'll get to a little bit later in this podcast. But I think the other risk that I think doesn't get thought about enough, and you and I have had conversations about this sort of, in our other interactions, is this notion that as technology comes in and new information is generated, the way we work has changed and sort of who's responsible for what and the span of control people have over the information and what people do with that information has fundamentally changed within organizations. You take process X, which in the past had 5 people and they all produce the same sort of standard report or whatever. And that report goes up to their manager who checks it for accuracy. And, that model has kind of been turned on its head because people are leveraging AI and other tools. So now instead of 5 people, let's say there's 3 people. And instead of those 3 people being in the same office, they're all over the world. And the generative models they're using for their first passes at things are all, similar, but slightly inconsistent. And now they themselves are exposed to information that they've never been exposed to, and they're generating data and conclusions that that traditional role hasn't, right? So thinking about it from those terms, and the idea of who's responsible for the data, who's responsible with the information, who has access to what, and who's affected by the sort of the shifting boundaries in terms of where people work and how they work and what they deal with is something I think organizations really need to consider.
Even again, internally, we've been thinking like the responsibility of data and those risks and who oversees it. And I know, like you were saying, and when we've talked before, audit committees are just their remit is expanding. What feels like probably daily, weekly of what does an audit committee oversee? What does a risk committee oversee? If there is a separate risk committee. So thinking through that, especially with your experience and the many people you've talked to and worked with, what are some of the hidden risk or different things that people may not be thinking about but should be? And what would you recommend that they do or think through so that that data isn't misused, or are there ungoverned processes that they should be thinking about?
On its most basic level, what we're trying to figure out is that whole sort of spectrum of authority versus accountability. And ideally, we want to match those things up so that the person that has authority over things are accountable for them. And there's good things and bad things with how business is evolving, right? With regards to technology. On the one hand, you see organizations becoming more flat, right? Which means that people are more involved and more engaged in the overall business. But then those lines of authority and accountability get blurred a little bit. And then you have situations where people are doing work where they're not held accountable to the outcomes, and people are held accountable to outcomes where they're just sort of the end result of all this stuff that happened before, and they don't have any influence into it. So how do we mitigate it? I mean, there's a lot of challenges that add complexity to it. The fact that we are becoming increasingly more digital and distributed and nomadic in terms of like where we work, how we work. People are multi-device. So that's the other thing. Controlling the operating environment that people work in is much more difficult. And the other thing too is within most organizations, there's probably a fairly significant shadow AI, shadow IT sort of culture that exists. And so how people can get ahead of it is just sort of embracing it. So I think if you have more transparency in terms of what the clear guidelines are, you have more engagement with the organization in terms of setting those guidelines so people clearly know what's inbound, what's out of bounds. Because, a lot of this risk is being developed because there just is no clear guideline. Companies are not coming up with clear use cases or clear definitions in terms of what's acceptable and what's not. And when people take, their own agency to play in the gray is where people can potentially get in trouble. So, my recommendations would be understand the environment, understand the complexity, understand how people want to work, make an effort to, uncover how they are working now, and have a shared sense of governance and responsibility around what is acceptable throughout the entire organization, given the risk tolerance that the organization as a whole has accepted. We recently worked with a client that's in the media industry, and we were doing this assessment for them. And the leader of one of the leaders of the industry or within the organization was just absolutely certain that no one in their organization was using these Gen AI tools, because they talk about in the office and they talk about, we're real journalists and real journalists write their own stuff and all that kind of stuff. And then we kind of, did a deeper dive into it, and we found out that, yeah, there are some that were like, I won't touch it. There's no way. It's against everything I believe in. We found like 57% of the people like in the organization were using Gen AI in some way. They were dabbling it here and there, getting brainstorming with it, and but a lot of times like I said, unless there's like clear direction and an open, transparent discussion around it, not just in terms of the risks that we're taking on, but the benefits of it too. I think you can have a deeper understanding of it and have a more honest conversation in terms of where does it fit in, how can we use it effectively, and how can we as an organization just have a shared point of view instead of this like cultural norm that people don't necessarily stick with in the shadows.
That's a really great point. So To think through a little bit about how internal audit could advise on some of this, do you have any thoughts on that, just specifically with internal audit, or things that you've seen well work with some of the clients you've worked with on advising the board, or even working with management on especially that authority and accountability piece?
The first action would be making sure that they themselves are comfortable having those conversations. Because oftentimes there is a lot of sort of comfort in the norm and adapting to a changing world, especially where you don't have the expertise into the direction where things are changing, can make people hesitant to sort of diving in. And I think that's especially present in accounting and finance people, because how we tend to get promoted and take bigger roles in our organization is by demonstrating hyper competency. It's like, I've got this, I understand what it is. I know the black and white in terms of the regulations, but I also know the gray because I'm really ethical, and I have a principled way of doing work. And when that is disruptive, sometimes people will double down in what they're most competent in, and they'll just kind of shove that stuff to the side. So I think, the step one would be embracing that discomfort and having an honest discussion within the function in terms of like, hey, are we ready for this sort of thing? Like, are we comfortable having a point of view and facilitating that discussion? And I think that's the other thing too, is part of it isn't necessarily dictating to the organization what they should do. It's really facilitating that conversation so that everyone has a broad understanding of what things should look like. And then they come in behind that and ensure that what has been agreed upon or what is necessary or regulatory prerequisite is followed. So that would be sort of my recommendation. I don't know if I specifically answered your question, but that's what I'm thinking in terms of like how they can work with boards in terms of understanding this. And they don't need to know all the answers, but they need to know how to have those conversations.
I like the idea of thinking through changing or reframing the conversation to risk navigation away from maybe risk avoidance. I think a lot of times accountants or people in finance or internal auditors may be more risk averse, and maybe sometimes humans just in general. But how do we think of it and lean into what would be appropriate, and thinking of it more as like navigating risk? And so what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it has to do with, especially when it comes to sort of emerging things like this in organizations, where if you have a purely risk avoidance sort of posture and you lean heavily into like regulatory guidance as your true North Star, I think you miss a lot of opportunity. And also, in some ways, you could be inviting risk into your organization, because when compliance isn't clear, or the risk really thought out, identified, and agreed upon within the organization. So, like, if I have a regulation that clearly defines ethical uses, or regulatory requirements or disclosure requirements or whatever, it's really, really easy for me to have that risk conversation with someone, because the rule says this. When the compliance isn't clear, then we need to change the way we have those conversations around, what are the guiding principles that we as an organization are following, sort of like the core values that we have, which sounds a lot like more squishy and not necessarily like as black or more white, but it's just kind of one of those things where failure to do that creates a lot of gray area and a lot of silence around what people should be doing or how they should be thinking. And when you have that kind of environment, it becomes really, really hard to figure out, what people are doing, assign accountability, assign authority, et cetera, because people will fill in to that gray space whatever they feel is most appropriate. Now, we'll give the people benefit of the doubt, right? Like, I think most people are trying to do the right thing, but they might not, especially as you go further away from leadership, they might not have as much visibility or insight in terms of what the true risk tolerance is, what are the true goals of the organization, those sort of things. So lacking those conversations in terms of guiding principles, ethical use, those kind of things wrapped around risk, So the conversation is, oh, if we do this, we will get in trouble with regulatory body X. Like that's an easy conversation. More difficult conversation is, hey, as we're navigating through this unregulated environment, it's really important that we don't lose sight of principle A, principle B, principle C, because that defines who we are as an organization. And that's what's really, really important to us. And so if you have any sort of conflict with that, let's have open discussions about it, anything on the margins, because that will help us define risk tolerance that affects us in a non-regulatory way. And the other thing too is, I think what oftentimes gets missed in this balance is oftentimes when these proposals for change get put in front of us, it's all the upside, right? All the great things that are going to happen, all the wonderful things that are going to do it. I think focusing in on, what is the cost of failure versus the reward of the success is a good way to frame it. Because if it's a situation, for example, where it's like, oh, we're going to bring in technology X and it's going to increase productivity by Y%. So yeah, we'll bring in this new workflow, Carey, and you're going to save 30 minutes a day on it. But then the question needs to be asked, well, what happens when it goes wrong? Okay, when it goes wrong, it's going to take us 7 days to recover. Is it worth it to save 30 minutes a day to have like this potential 7-day catastrophe? And then, well, what's the likelihood of that happening? It's, so that just gives a deeper conversation in terms of not just what do things look like when they go right, but what do things look like when they potentially go wrong? Is that risk worth it in the long run in terms of disruption?
So I think as we kind of wrap up here, I really would love to hear your thoughts on what is one action that audit committees can take now to prepare for disruption. Hopefully people are preparing and have been preparing, but maybe think about it in a maturity, like if someone really hasn't, but also for those that you've experienced who have seen a lot, like how can they keep going?
The best thing to do is to scenario plan in your business. What do things look like when things go well? What do things look like when things go a little bit wrong? And what do things look like when things go completely off the rails, right? Because you want to remove yourself from that crisis thinking. All the pressures that go in, like, oh my God, like sometimes there's so many actions to be taken, can be overwhelming, and you're probably not in the best mindset to be making the most efficient decisions. So the extent that you can scenario plan out, like, what do we do if catastrophe X strikes us, right? Like, what do we do if we wake up tomorrow and everything is locked down because there was a cyber attack and now they want us to spend, like, I don't know, they want us to send like 100,000 Bitcoin to some weird place, right? What do we do? And, you can get more narrow in terms of scenarios as you have more resources and become more mature. But at a basic level, it's like, what are sort of the rudimentary steps that we need to do when things go wrong? So that when things go wrong, you're not wasting your time, at least on those first initial actions. You're spending more time on the bigger problems that are in front of you, which could hopefully lead to better outcomes, mitigating the loss, getting back online quicker. So that would probably be my best advice. And then if you're going to do that, continuously assessing, because as we mentioned earlier, the environment around us is continuously changing. So continuously assessing what those best actions are and just having a playbook of like, hey, basic ABCs, when a problem happens, these are the 5 steps that we do. So you don't have to think about them and work on those bigger problems.
That's great. We've been seeing scenario planning come up as in some of our research that people need to do. So I love how you talked about that and talked through it. So thank you so much, Marko, for joining us today.
Always a pleasure speaking with you, Carey. And it's great to see the work that you guys are doing, helping people think through these increasingly complex and changing problems.
Ready to lead with confidence? Join the IIA's 2025 RISE virtual conference on December 5th, all online. Earn up to 7.2 CPEs while diving into resilience, innovation, strategy, and ethics with today's top audit leaders. Save your spot now at theiaa.org. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch other episodes on YouTube or at theiaa.org. That's THEIIA.org.